소개하겠습니다. 첫 번째로 특강을 해주신 애틀렛 디 르그로브 박사님은 Children's War Foundation의 공동 창립자이시자 현재 디렉터로 역임하고 계십니다. 아울러서 Children's War Foundation의 해외 이사회 위원을 역임하고 계시는 스테픈 리갈도 함께 소개해드리고자 합니다. 예, 두 분, stand up please and shake hands. 예, 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 예.
She's going to introduce you first, and then you can start, and she's going to introduce me probably, and then you can start your lecture, and I'll be sitting up there.
And I will be in eye contact.
Yes. 네, 간단하게만 해주세요.
소개 순서가 조금, 좀 꼬였습니다. 사실은 우리, 디 르그로브 박사님과 닥터 리갈 같은 경우에 지난주 목요일날 입국을 하셔서요. 금요일날부터 어제 일요일까지 3일 동안 TRT라고 하는 전문가 워크숍을 진행을 하셨습니다. 그래서 수십 년간 이 재난심리 관련된 그런 그 현장을 돌아다니시면서 경험과 지식을 쌓으신 재난심리 관련된 베테랑 전문가들이라고 소개를 해드리고자 합니다. 그리고 오늘 통역은 소아정신과 전문가이시자 현 울산대학교 연구교수로 재직하고 계신 장형윤 선생님께서 수고해 주시겠습니다. 현재 좀 임신 중이셔서 조금 앉아서 진행하시는 걸로 양해해 주시기 바라겠습니다. 네, 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
Good afternoon. It's a deep honor for me to be able to address you. I know only too well what has befallen your country with the disaster. I worked with disasters for 30 years, starting with the war in Uganda in 1984 and then going on to different disasters, air crashes and earthquakes and ferry disasters and other disasters. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the experience and the learnings that we have from our part of the world, which you call overseas. We call you overseas from our part. The main person here today will be Yoon. She's a tremendous translator, but it'll be hard for her because I tend to talk fast and much, and she's going to translate. Disasters are different. They vary in numbers and the variety of casualties they cause. Some disasters have no survivors, like air crashes. Some have survivors. Some leave a lot of bereaved. There's always a variety here. And they always start with chaos and lack of resources. And sometimes afterwards there's too much resources pouring in. Everyone wants to help, and it gets chaotic from that reason. It has effects on the society, and it has effects on the health system. And some disasters, they affect not only one country, but many countries, like the tsunami in 2004. Some disasters cause a lot of loss on infrastructure, like earthquakes, while a thing like the ferry disaster doesn't cause destruction in that area. But all disasters put pressure on health systems and the need for multidisciplinary teams, from the first rescue operations until the later follow-up. There's always the need for different professions, and they need to work from similar mental models. And there's so many tasks that we have to perform. And it's also the truth that when disasters are different, our response and interventions need to be different. It's not like we can take a blueprint from one disaster and say, we'll do this time too. Every disaster needs its own individual follow-up. And the most important aspect of all follow-up disaster is to be able to be flexible. Flexible to the needs of the people who are hit by the disaster, first of all, but also flexible in our approaches, in our systems, and then when it's finished and we've done the work, use the experience to better our preparedness plans for the next disaster. Because there's one thing that's always certain, there will be a new disaster sometime. So we need to be better prepared when that happens. When I've been asked to say something about how we work overseas, I must say that it's very different from country to country. There isn't like one model we follow in Europe and the same model in the US. We in Norway can have different systems than our neighboring countries, Sweden and Denmark. So it's not like I can just say this is the model we use, because there isn't a model like that. The different interventions used in different countries have different historical, they have different cultural backgrounds, and it also is built on our experiences. For example, Norway, where you probably know that as a peaceful country, and maybe you think that not much happens there, but we've had a lot of various disasters, air crashes, ferry disasters, storms or hurricanes that have left the country partly ruined in places. So we have built experience from that, and that gives us our unique experience. But what has become, both in Europe and the US, more and more certain is that we have gradually developed a proactive way of intervening. That means that it's a lot that's done from the beginning or even before it happens that is proactive. And I'll explain that more in the next slide here. Because proactive means that we reach out. We have an outreach effort. We intervene early. We early give information about the event and the potential reactions that people might experience. I'll return to that a bit later to say something about it, but we try to guide people in their important questions they have. For example, should children be in on returning to the scene of events? Should they see the dead body? These are important questions that parents pose, and we try to give them advice from an early age. We know very well from the support groups how important it is to meet with others in the same situation. So we try to make use of the collective experience. And that's being gradually done in more and more countries. They respect that there's the only ones that really know exactly how it is are those who have experienced the same. So we try to make use of that. We want to make it known to those who are affected over time where they can get help and what helping efforts are available. And we try to improve the knowledge base of the helpers so that the quality of the help is bettered and it's more competent. Because those who are survivors or are bereaved need specific help, not only general help over time. I'll return to that too. And as I mentioned, flexibility and tailoring the help to the individual has become more and more something that we think is important in our countries in Europe and the US. And then we also, from the feedback from those who are hit by disasters, we know that they say that your systems were okay in the beginning, but they were not good over time. There was too little help over time and too little stability in the helpers. So we are trying to build in more stability and more long-reaching help than we used to do before.
네, 저 시간 관계상 제가 한 슬라이드 끝날 때마다 통역하는 게 아니라 한 3개에서 5개 정도 슬라이드 지나가면 요약해서 간단하게 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다. 아트레 박사님은 약 30년간 재난 현장에서 경험을 쌓으셨고, 오늘 그 해외에서의, 전 세계 해외에서의 경험들을 함께 나눠주시겠다고 합니다. 재난은 그 각각의 재난마다 굉장히 특성이 달라서 사망자 유무나 기반시설이 파괴되기도 하고, 여러 가지 과제들이 나타난다는 점이 각각의 재난마다 다르다고 설명을 하였고, 그렇지만 굉장히 여러 집단이 여러 가지의 과제들을 함께 하고 처음에 혼란이 나타난다는 점은 공통점이라고 하였습니다. 그래서 각각의 재난이 다르기 때문에 그에 대한 개입 방법도 달라지게 되고, 그러한 대처나 접근 방법들은 유연해야 할 필요가 있다고 하였습니다. 그리고 항상 재난은 다음 또 재난이 일어날 수 있는 가능성을 내포하고 있기 때문에 배운 것들을 취합해서 다음 재난을 준비할 수 있도록 해야 된다고 하였습니다. 해외에서의 그 재난에 있어서 사회심리적 개입 방법은 나라마다 다르고, 그것은 역사나 사회적, 문화적 배경이 다르고 또 그 사회가 나라가 갖고 있는 경험이 다르기 때문이라고 말을 하였는데요. 점차적으로 조금 더 적극적이고 다가가는 프로액티브한 모델이 받아들여지고 있다고 하였습니다. 그러면 그 재난을 경험한 사람들이 기대하는 것은 조금 더 먼저 다가가는 프로액티브하고 리치아웃하는 반응이라고 설명을 하였는데요. 초기에 도움이 진행이 되어야 되고, 사건에 대한 정보나 방향 제시가 진행이 되어야 되고, 같은 경험을 한 사람들이 함께 대화할 수 있는 집단이 도움이 된다고 하였습니다. 그리고 저희가 구조자들이나 전문가들이 도움을 줄 때 그 도움이 전문적이고 충분할 수 있도록 해야 되고, 유연성 역시 중요하고, 이러한 도움이 제공이 될 때 이것이 시간이 지남에 따라서도 계속 유지가 되고, 초기뿐만 아니라 더 길게 도움이 유지되는 게 필요하다고 하였습니다.
One of the features that we've seen in disasters in Europe especially is that the support groups have been formalizing early. So survivors and bereaved have formed groups that have been political pressure groups towards governments to get both better safety but also better services for the bereaved. And we think this has been very positive because it's led to changes. But it's come from those who have been affected. For example, in Norway, after we had the murder on an island of 69 young people in 2011, the support group has been a major mover in getting better system within the police, get better follow-up services for survivors and for bereaved. And they've been wonderful in advocating this, and they've been collaborating with us in the health directorate. I was part of the health director's response in this area, and they can take the pulse much better on how it is within the bereaved group than we as professionals who are outside of the group. I should also say that when it comes to early intervention, there's been a lot of discussions, and some say, stay off, don't do anything until at least a month afterwards when it comes to more therapeutic aspects here. While others say, no, we have to start early, we have to go in early to prevent. And there's been discussion, some of you know, I know about the discussion regarding psychological debriefing, which has been a very silly discussion out there, but it still is some of these professional disputes that also has made problems for us. I am in favor of a proactive approach, and I think most people are, and most professionals also are that, but they are careful with starting too early with therapy. And I think that's good advice, but we can do so much more in that early period that's not therapy, but is still very helpful. We can try to guide those who are hit by a disaster in the direction we want them to go, so they don't go on to have problems over years afterwards. There was recently an article published that, for those of you who are interested in this field, will see it sums up some of the knowledge or some of the experiences, both in Europe and the US. It's trying to cover the world, but it's mostly based on European and American research. And it says, lessons learned about psychosocial responses to disaster and mass trauma, an international perspective. And in this article, Reifelsen and co-workers sum it up in these points. And you can see how it is some of the same that I already have mentioned. Is that tailor-making, trying to be more specific with what you do regarding which disaster it is. It's the multi-dimensional. People in disasters don't need only psychological help. They need sometimes social help. They need help from lawyers. There's a wide variety of things they need. We know that some groups are especially at risk. For example, parents who lose children. That is a high-risk group. There's a majority of them that struggle with problems over a long period of time, and we're talking about years here. So that's a high-profile group. We know that the more you've been exposed to the disaster, if you're a survivor, you can be a survivor who wasn't that much exposed, and you can be a survivor that was very much exposed, and exposure goes in. The degree of felt life threat is another of these things that will give a higher expectation of problems in the aftermath. We also try to meet the barriers to access of care. For example, in adolescents who often will, no, I don't want or I don't need any help. So we need to have the systems geared towards them in a different manner. I'll return to that too. We recognize the social, or they recognize here in this article, the social dimensions and sources of resilience. How can you foster resilience, not only on the individual level, but also on the family level and the community level? How can you build resilient communities after a disaster? And we know that the roles for mental health professionals are usually that they can be used in many areas. For example, guiding political leaders in their decisions, because sometimes politicians make decisions that are in contrary to the needs of the bereaved. I worked with the first school shooting that took place in Scotland many years ago, and in that disaster, the politicians decided to just tear down the hall where this happened very soon afterwards. And that hall could have been used for those who were families to return to process what has happened to them, but by the political decision, they took away that possibility, because they thought politically they didn't have any input then on the psychological ramifications of that. They also recommend the efficient coordination and integration of disaster response services. Now that is, again, having similar mental models, that we who come from the psychosocial aspects know how they think within the police and the rescue services, and they know something about us. And then the last point, to integrate research and evaluation into disaster response planning. That we need to learn systematically from a disaster to be able to better the plans later. These are some of the recommendations, and they're also in line with those of you who know about psychological first aid, where they base these on Hobsbawm's principles on promoting a sense of safety, calming, a sense of self and collective efficacy, and connectedness and hope. That's our parts of what's going into the plans in many countries overseas now. It's trying to get this integrated. I should say for Norway and Scandinavia, but I think so in some of the other countries too, that the community expectations are becoming very high. If in Norway everyone, if there's a death, sudden death of suicide or accident, doesn't have to be in a disaster, they expect to get the best medical help, and they expect a psychosocial crisis team to be there very soon after. So there's incredibly high expectations of getting help. it's been the media who's focused so much on disaster responses that the public in general now expect the system to function incredibly well, efficient, and that they early get that help. And we cannot always fulfill these expectations. They are too high. So it's our role now to make them maybe a little less high, because you cannot expect that there will be a team of professionals that's ready to move out at any time. That's not how we can use health resources. And we also know that it's not what you need in the first few hours in these single incidents.
네, 51페이지 아래 슬라이드부터 다시 말씀드리겠습니다. 해외에서 이러한 재난에 있어서 사회심리적 개입을 진행할 때 생존자들이나 유가족들로 이루어진 집단, 이런 지지 집단들이 정부에게 이러한 그 대처에 대해서 압력을 넣는 굉장히 중요한 집단으로 부각이 되었다고 합니다. 이들은 경험자이고 내부자이기 때문에 어떤 게 더 필요한지 잘 알 수 있고, 그래서 2011년에 있었던 노르웨이에 있었던 총격 사건에서도 이 생존자들이나 유가족들의 집단이 굉장히 큰 역할을 하였다고 합니다. 당시에 아틀레 박사님은 의료지원 담당으로 일을 하시게 되었는데, 아무래도 전문가는 바깥 사람이다 보니까 이러한 그 실제 유가족들이나 생존자 집단과 일을 하는 게 많은 도움이 되고 정부의 압력이 되었고, 이들을 도울 때 어떻게 접근하는 게 좋은 것이냐에 대한 두 가지 그 상반되는 태도가 있는데, 하나는 조금 더 지켜보고 문제가 발생하면 그때 접근을 해서 도와주고 개입을 하자는 게 있고, 또 하나는 미리 예방하는 차원에서 먼저 초기에 다가가는 접근을 해야 된다는 게 있는데, 그 아틀레 박사님은 두 번째 후자의 시각에 더 동의를 하고, 너무 초기에 혹은 너무 의료적으로 개입을 하는 것은 조심해야 되고 경계를 해야 되지만, 꼭 치료부터 시작을 하는 게 아니라 도움을 줄 수 있는 여러 방법들이 있기 때문에 먼저 좀 더 적극적으로 예방의 차원에서 도움을 주는 게 좋다고 말씀하셨습니다. 다음 페이지 보시면 최근에 나온 논문을 하나 소개해 주셨는데, 이러한 그 국제적인 여러 재난이나 외상 사건들에서 사회심리적 개입에 대해서 우리가 배울 수 있는 점들이라는 논문으로 유럽과 미국에서의 경험들을 정리한 내용이라고 합니다. 그 아래 보시면 재난에 따라 구체적으로 그 사회심리적 개입과 반응을 맞춰야 된다. 여러 가지 측면과 차원의 도움이 필요하다. 그리고 더 위험한 고위험군을 도움을 확인을 해야 되는데, 특히 뭐 예를 들어 자녀가 사망한 부모 같은 경우에는 굉장히 오랜 시간 동안 힘들 수 있고, 그러한 사고에 더 심하게 노출되었던 경우, 아니면 본인이 느꼈던 위협감이 더 컸던 경우가 더 위험군이라고 말을 하였습니다. 또한 우리가 도움을 줌에 있어서 발생할 수 있는 장애물들을 확인을 해야 되는데, 예를 들어서 청소년 같은 경우에는 도움을 받기를 거부하는 것 역시 장애물이 될 수 있고, 이걸 어떻게 도울지는 후에 다시 설명해 주신다고 하였습니다. 사회적 측면이나 아니면 개인, 가족, 사회의 회복 탄력성을 증진시키는 방법에 대해서도 생각을 해야 되고, 정신건강 전문가의 역할을 충분히 활용을 해서 예를 들어 정치인들을 조언하는 그런 데에도 정신건강 전문가가 역할을 할 수 있다고 하였습니다. 대응 서비스를 조율하고 통합하는 게 필요하고, 재난 대응 계획을 진행을 할 때 연구나 평가의 내용이 포함되는 게 필요하다고 하였습니다. 그래서 이러한 그 방법들을 통해서 사람들이 다시 안전하고 효율적으로 일상으로 복귀할 수 있도록 도와야 된다고 하였습니다. 다음 슬라이드 보시면 사회에서 이 재난에 대해서 어떻게 대응하는 게 좋을지에 대한 기대 수준이 점점 높아지고 있고, 특히 북유럽에서는 굉장히 높다고 합니다. 언론에서는 홍보가 많이 되어서 큰 재난이 아니라 자살이나 사고 같은 그런 사건이 있을 때에도 사회심리적 위기 개입팀이 바로 개입이 되어서 아주 초기에 효율적으로 이러한 부분들이 이루어지기를 기대를 하는 그런 사회적 기대가 있다고 합니다.
Thank you. What are the benefits of psychosocial services? Why have we put much more effort into doing this in overseas countries. But first of all, we think and we have some knowledge that it creates a more rapid normalization of the situation for both individuals, families, and society. We also know that it will be able to prevent some long-term impairment among survivors and bereaved. There's enough studies to show that it brings down the problems in the groups. We also think that this can stimulate social support and cohesion. We want to, the more we do, the less conflict we can be able to avoid. And there's also the potentiality of growth among those who are there. It's very hard to bring that in at an early stage when it comes to bereaved, but over time they can see it themselves, that there might be something good coming out of something so bad. And we can improve our systems for the future. We know something will happen again, so let's be better prepared for the next. If we look at the intervention, there are different time phases. In the early days, the first days and the first week after a disaster, it's often called psychological first aid, where it's information and care that's most important. I'll say more about that later. It's social, practical support, it's psychoeducational information, and it's advice, as I mentioned, on important decisions. And then you go over to the following weeks, and that's where you start helping people also to organize their story, to create cohesion in their experience. You need often then to meet the family, because there's issues within the family that are important. And this is where you can use the group potential. You can use the collective support potential and start that in the first few weeks. Now, it's important also to, at least when it comes to trauma, to find those who, after about a month's time, are still suffering very much from the trauma effects, because then you can start to intervene and do something about that. So it's been, for example, in England after the London bombings, they manned a big screening procedure by those who were affected and were able to screen out many individuals who then benefited from psychological help. While if they just used the family physicians, they identified very few. So you need to be systematic to be able to provide help for many. But you can, of course, have resistance towards this, but we've seen that we've used this after the murders on the island as well. We used questionnaires, we used interviews to detect those who are in need of more help. And then over time you need family sessions, and you need more and more the trauma and loss focused system in there. You need, for example, grief therapy treatment that is specific. You don't need just to talk about the loss you've experienced. If you're dealing with longing too much and it's there every day, you need something that will help you specifically to set aside time to go towards the loss so it doesn't influence your whole day. Put in another way, you can say that when the traumatic event happens, we have immediate interventions that secure that people get access to the facts and they can share these facts, that they have an understanding of what happened. Then the traumatic event will lead to different reactions, so we can try to have preventative intervention with psychoeducation, helping the family talk openly about something that's happened, so that's more on the family client. And then if it goes on and they start to lose functionality, when they're not functional, that's when we think that you have more therapy coming in. So at this time here, it's not therapy, that will come later. But that doesn't mean that what we do won't be therapeutic. But we don't start offering therapy too early. That would be it'd be overkilling in a way those who are affected. One of the things that in modern research has been very influential in our thinking about early intervention is that when we experience something traumatic, we take in the information, and this information is consolidated it's put into storage in our memory, and then we have to recall it to bring it back. And we know that the more aroused the person is, the more the body is aroused, and there's a lot of adrenaline, the more they remember and the more they suffer afterwards. So that means in the immediate period after a disaster, what we can do to calm people or get people to not be that very physically aroused, the more we do that, the less they will be troubled afterwards. And that can be done by psychological means, by the caring system we have. Of course, there's also pharmacological ways of doing that, but that's not something that is, at this day and state in history, it's not being recommended. There isn't a trauma pill you can take that will take away these reactions. So what we know of the immediate care is that there's two things, and I think this goes all around the world, will be exactly the same wherever you are in the world. If you're able to have a good information flow, where those who are affected get good information about what happened, if they are unsure about that, what is going to happen, what was the reason for what happened, well, how will I be cared for, and how is it with my family members? What's the safety of my family members? If we are able to do that in a caring climate, we are calming people down. So that's the most important parts of the early crisis intervention, is this combination of good information and a caring climate. If we're able, and there's research coming out now more and more on this acute phase that shows that this is the same if you have a medical event in the hospital or you have a disaster or you have your single crisis event, that you need to do this. And this is the feedback we get from those who are affected too. I had a mother mother of two. She was outside watching a helicopter that crashed with her husband inside, and she had a 6- and 4-year-old with her. And then she got somebody to care for the two children, and she tried to get to the crash site, and as soon as she got there, she was prohibited from entering, of course, but she said there were two things I needed. I needed somebody to confirm that my husband was dead, and I needed somebody to hold around me. And that's exactly what I'm talking about here, information and care. But she didn't get that at that time, and it was deeply affecting her that no one was available for her in the situation. Have I promised a break now? Yes, I have. Okay.
네, 언제 통역을 할지 미리 약속을 했는데 하나 더 하셨습니다. 네, 이런 재난 상황에서 사회심리적 서비스를 제공하는 것의 장점에 대해서 말씀을 하였는데, 더 빨리 상황이 정상화되고 그다음에 장기적인 문제들이 더 감소하게 된다고 합니다. 그리고 사회적 지지와 사회의 집결력이 더 증가함으로써 사회 갈등이 감소하게 되고, 그다음에 초기에는 어렵지만 성장의 가능성이 더 부각이 되고, 그다음에 미래의 또 다른 재난에 더 잘 준비할 수 있게 된다고 하였습니다. 54페이지 보시면 재난 이후의 개입 순서에 대해서 그래프가 그려져 있는데요. 처음에는 심리적인 응급조치라고 해서 정보와 보살핌 그리고 여러 가지 조언들이 포함이 되고, 그 후에 몇 주 동안의 시간 동안에는 가족이 자기의 이야기를 정리할 수 있도록 하여서 집결력을 증가시키고, 가족을 만나서 문제를 해결하고 여러 가지 집단들을 사용할 수 있다고 하였습니다. 그 다음에 몇 달에 외상의 사건의 경우 몇 달에 걸쳐서 선별 검사를 통해서 증상 여부를 확인하고 발견하고 그 증상이 있는 경우에 도움을 줄 수가 있고, 그보다 더 장기적으로는 가족 회귀나 아니면은 외상이나 애도와 관련된 특정 문제나 병이 있는 경우에는 그에 따른 구체적인 치료를 들어갈 수 있다고 하였습니다. 아래 슬라이드 보시면 3개의 단계로 정리가 되어 있는데, 처음에 외상 사건이 발생한 다음에 즉각적인 개입으로는 사실과 정보들이 제공이 되어야 되고, 이런 것들을 충분히 이해하는지 확인을 해야 된다고 합니다. 그 다음에 시간이 지남에 따라서 사람마다 각기 다른 반응들을 보이게 되는데, 이 문제를 예방하는 차원에서 여러 가지 교육들이 진행이 되어야 되고 가족이 가족 안에서 대화를 충분히 할 수 있도록 도움을 주어야 한다고 하였습니다. 그 다음에 조금 더 시간이 지난 후에 기능이 떨어지는 경우, 즉 원래 하던 일을 그만큼 못하게 되는 경우에는 치료적 개입이 필요하게 되고 이때 이 마지막 단계가 되기 전에는 저희가 치료를 하는 것은 아니고 도움을 주는 것이라고 하였습니다. 그렇지만 도움을 주는 것 역시 치료적일 수는 있다라고 설명을 하셨고요. 55페이지 윗 슬라이드 보시면 이제 저희 기억의 그 생리에 대해서 초기 개입이 왜 중요한지를 이해의 그 과학적 바탕에 대해서 말씀을 하였는데 우리가 충격적인 일을 경험을 하게 되면 이 일이 공고화되고 우리 뇌 속에 저장이 되어서 나중에 이게 반출이 되는 그런 기억 시스템을 갖고 있는데 우리가 더 많이 놀라고 긴장하고 흥분했을수록 기억이 더 강하게 남고 그에 따라서 괴로움도 더 커진다고 합니다. 그래서 이런 처음에 기억이 입력되는 과정에서 사람을 안정시킬 수 있으면 나중에 괴로움도 더 적다고 하고 그러한 여러 가지 방법으로는 심리적 방법들이 많지만 약물적 방법도 있기는 한데 지금 현재 권장되고 있지는 않다고 합니다. 이러한 재난에서의 개입에 즉각적인 접근은 크게 두 가지 측면에서 생각을 할 수 있는데 하나는 정보를 잘 제공하는 것이고 두 번째는 이게 따뜻하고 보살핌을 받는 안정적인 분위기 안에서 이루어져야 한다고 하였습니다. 그래서 정보는 지금 이 어떤 일이 일어난 건지 그리고 앞으로 어떻게 일들이 진행될 건지 왜 이런 일이 일어났는지 또 앞으로 우리는 어떻게 하면 되고 어떻게 도움을 받을 수 있는지에 대해서 정보가 제공이 되어야 되고 이것은 안정적이고 보살핌을 받는 케어링 매너, 따뜻한 분위기에서 진행이 되어야 한다고 하였습니다.
I already have talked about several of the points here. The information, having adequate information systems, and also leaders who understand the symbolic value in these situations. Political leaders can have a very strong influence on how the people feel. The way they phrase themselves afterwards, the way they offer support, the way they have the signal value of being there. I worked with a terror event last year where we had 39 people killed in Algeria who were taken hostage by militia or by an Al-Qaeda group. And 5 Norwegians were killed and several survived. And we had a center for those that were waiting for news on their loved ones. And we had the Prime Minister visiting there. We had the Crown Prince and the Queen. And these symbolic visits by the political figures have an easing on the effects of those who are involved. As long as they're not seen as somebody who has been irresponsible in the handling of the event, of course. The other aspects on this list I won't comment now because then I run out of time. So I'll skip that and go on to just list some of the different ways that we can use to help and that we use in different disasters in our part of the world. We use group meetings. We use a lot of group meetings, a lot of gatherings. We have both for survivors and for bereaved. We will use these gatherings where they all are present, and we divide them in smaller groups, but we also use plenary sessions. I'll give you an example on that towards the end of my speech. We use psychoeducation. We have family-based follow-up. That we know where there's a death in the beginning, they are not taking in what the other bereaved so much experience. It's their own family reactions we need to deal with. We are working on social network reintegration and information to the social network so they'll be better in their response to the families. We give them both over the internet but also written information on self-help strategies. And of course there's individual help for those we deem need that kind of help after some time. And the use of the internet is coming more and more in, as I'm sure it is with you, where we also can deliver therapy through the internet. And in the Netherlands, they've used this after the tsunami. where people could get help that way because they had problems accessing the help in other ways. That's also an avenue to use with adolescents because sometimes they don't want to go to a clinician, they don't want to go see anyone, but they're very familiar with the internet. So getting treatment through the internet is a way that we can go about this. One of the things that has been used in several countries, especially our country, which Norway is in the front line in many respects when it comes to handling disasters. It has historical reasons, but it's been so. And that is what we call for confrontational coping, which means going to the site of the incident, going through reports, reviewing the autopsy report together with the families, viewing photos, films, and we have documented that this has an effect. For example, we had plane loads of people who survived the tsunami who went back to Thailand and to the beaches to get their fear of the water down again. And they were measured before and after, and it definitely had an effect on them. We're now conducting a study on this island accident on how important it was for them to go back to the island, to see the island. When I was with the survivors we had 495 survivors of that shooting on that small island. And 1 month after that shooting, we went back to the island with the survivors. The second day, we had the bereaved one day, and then survivors. When they were out there, they had another cognitive way of dealing with this than before, because they could see the distances. They could move there and see how close they had been to the one who shot all these 69. They could sense where they hid. They could look at it under calm, quiet circumstances, and it gave them a total overview and an understanding of the situation that they didn't have before. And you could hear this when you walked around with the survivors, that, this was how it was. I thought it was much longer. It wasn't that long. So you could see how it clicked in the right way in the brain in the situation. Now, why do we do this? Well, it's because returning to a scene of event or doing this, it creates coherence. You can build a story from beginning to end. You get a chronology, you get a time line for what you experience. You get more cognitive clarity, and you can counteract phobia formation. So if you have started being afraid, for example, of going to islands, going there will have that effect, just like with the sea for those who return to Thailand after the tsunami. It integrates the experience, and it helps also, for example, those who survived. When they came out on the island, there were two things that was important. One was to go the route they had escaped from the killer. And the other one was going to the site where a friend died and do a ritual. So they placed a flower at that site. That was so important for so many of them. So you see the combination there.
Shall I?
Yeah.
네. 56페이지 윗 슬라이드부터 하겠습니다. 앞서 이제 즉각적인 접근과 개입에 대해서 얘기하였고, 그 다음에 그 후 추적에 대해서 말씀을 하셨는데, 정보를 제공하는 것이 굉장히 중요하고, 정치인들이 갖고 있는 그런 영향, 그들의 상징성이 굉장히 큰 부분이다, 중요하다라고 말씀을 하시고, 그 밑에 내용들은 읽어보시면 될 것 같습니다. 그 다음에 재난이 있은 후에 할 수 있는 개입들에는 여러 가지 방법들이 있는데, 생존자나 유가족들 집단으로 함께 접근하는 것도 가능하고, 가족들을 확인하고, 교육이 이루어지고 사회적 네트워크가 더 잘 대응할 수 있도록 돕고, 여러 자조 기법들이나 아니면 개인적, 개별적 도움들, 그리고 인터넷 사용들도 가능하다고 합니다. 특히 청소년 같은 경우에는 실제로 면담을 하거나 상담을 하는 것보다는 인터넷 사용을 더 선호하는 경향이 있다고 하였습니다. 57페이지 보시면 confrontational coping, 직면을 사용하는 대응 방법에 대해서 설명하셨습니다. 이것은 재난이 발생한 이후에 그 생존자나 유가족들이 그 재난 현장을 실제로 방문하고, 그리고 그 재난에 대한 여러 가지 정보들을 제공받고 그 정보들을 함께 리뷰하고, 예를 들어 사건에 대한 보고서나 아니면 부검 보고서, 그리고 그 사건과 관련된 사건의 사진들, 언론 그 내용들 같은 것을 함께 리뷰하는 것이 치료적으로 도움이 된다고 하였습니다. 그래서 쓰나미나 총경사건 같은 경우에도 다시 이렇게 재난 장소나 그와 관련된 내용들을 보는 것이 도움이 되었는데, 이러한 것들을 다시 안정적이고 조용한 환경에서 함께 리뷰할 수 있게 되면은 이 사건을 조망할 수 있는 능력이 생기고 거리를 두고 바라볼 수 있게 돼서 다시금 이 사건을 정리되고 정돈된 상태로 이해할 수 있게 된다고 합니다. 그래서 생존자 같은 경우에는 실제는 여기가 더 먼 줄 알았다, 더 가까운 줄 알았다, 이런 것들을 실제로 다시 안정된 환경에서 접하는 게 도움이 된다고 하고, 그게 도움이 되는 이유가 아래 슬라이드에 적혀져 있습니다. 우선 이 사건에 대해서 일관성이 있는 코히어런트한 이해를 할 수 있게 도와주고, 시간 순서에 따라서 이 사건을 정리할 수 있도록 도와준다고 합니다. 그리고 인지적으로 더 명료하게 이해할 수 있고, 공포증, 예를 들어 바다에 대한 공포증이 생긴다거나 재난과 관련된 공포증이 발생하는 것 자체를 초기에 막을 수 있다고 합니다. 그리고 자신이 했던 이 경험을 통합할 수 있게 도와주고, 이러한 절차나 의뢰들, 가서 꽃을 놓고 온다든지 이런 의뢰들을 통해서 자신의 정서적인 어려움들을 처리하고 해결할 수 있는 기회도 된다고 합니다.
Okay, I'll mention some of these points and comments on some of them, but what I'm doing now is to take up some of the lessons learned that we have and focus on some of them. Now, one of the things we know is that it's not only those who are within the mental health field that needs to know psychological first aid. It's very often those who are first responders. They will provide the first help, the emotional help. So they need to know about the principles of psychological first aid. I'll also want to mention the last point here, and that is the impact on staff. That we really have to have systems in place for caring for helpers. Now, that means both the possibility for individual help that is needed, but usually it's a form of debriefing or a way to put words to your experience, what you experience. So that's something that comes out from all disasters, that is a need. And the more children involved, the worse it is for helpers, the more you have these systems there. When it comes to psychoeducational information, it's important that this information is not just listing all the problems you can get, or all the symptoms you can have, because that can make self-fulfilling prophecies. So it needs to be information that is also very specific of what can you do to counteract problems that you might experience. These are some of the self-help techniques as well. So you have to balance that information. There's been a research, especially from the UK, from England, that has shown that some of these information leaflets that we give may even create more distress among those who have been through the event. So we must be careful with how we formulate this. We also seen we have that in Norway now. We get a lot of critique from bereaved and survivors after the shootings, because they say that, yes, we have had access to psychologists, we have had access to psychiatrists, but we don't get specific help. We just get somebody who talks with us. That doesn't help if you have intrusive images. So you need that trauma knowledge or that grief knowledge that is more specific in here. Another aspect that we especially learned after a disaster in Sweden, in Gothenburg, was that the systems met adolescents with a system that was rigid, and where the adolescents were into the system once and didn't want to come back. So we need flexible systems that offer the adolescents something that they feel that they are being helped, that is not on the system's condition, it's on the adolescent's condition. That's an important knowledge that we've seen here. We also, I've already mentioned this, that we do need to have knowledge of the modern helping methods that has come. There's now, when I started working in the 1980s with trauma, I was very ineffectual. There were many I couldn't help. Today, we have the technology or we have the tools that we can help. So it's we need to update and upgrade that knowledge. We also know that media can be, that's what do they call it in English? Pain in the neck? Awful. I'm the father of 2 journalists. I shouldn't say so, but sometimes I want to kick that media very far away because they cause so much problems for us. But we can also use them. We can use them to get information out there, to give information on normal reactions, and we can have a positive collaboration with them. But it's hard sometimes that when they have created more problems for us at the start. I mentioned the leaders. One of the things that come across all the disasters that I know of, and when I speak to colleagues in the US and UK and other countries, is the importance of rituals and having symbols and taking care of these ritualistic markings of a situation. And there's always conflict when it comes to monuments and how one should commemorate what happened. So that's an area where you need to be several who use time to think together sorry, to deal with this. The last point before I hand over to you again is that, of course, in these situations, you have to prioritize by groups. You make a hierarchy of who's most affected, and you concentrate your resources on that. And then you go down the line. But you have to think of both bereaved survivors and, as I mentioned, the helpers.
네, 58페이지 윗 슬라이드에 요점들이 정리가 되어 있고요. 그중에 첫 번째 내용은 이러한 심리적 응급처치에 대해서 정신건강 전문가뿐만이 아니라 이 재난에 함께하는 모든 사람들, 모든 구조자들이 알고 있어야 된다는 내용이었고요. 마지막을 보시면 이러한 구조자나 직원들이 재난을 경험한 사람들을 더 잘 도와줄 수 있게 시스템이 잘 준비되어 있어야 한다는 내용이었습니다. 그래서 그 아래 슬라이드를 보시면은 우리가 이 생존자나 유가족들, 피해자들에게 여러 가지 정신교육적인 심리와 관련된 교육적인 정보들을 제공하게 되는데 그렇게 함에 있어서 조금 더 그 질을 좋게 향상시킬 수 있는 방법에 대해서 말씀하였습니다. 이런 것들을 제공할 때 이런 증상들이 앞으로 나타날 수 있다. 이런 문제들이 앞으로 나타날 수 있다라고 문제나 증상만 나열하는 것은 크게 도움이 되지 못하고 어떨 때에는 오히려 그런 것을 보고 더 그런 증상들이 많이 생길 수도 있다고 하였습니다. 그래서 이러한 정보들을 제공할 때에는 생길 수 있는 문제나 증상뿐만 아니라 그럴 때 어떻게 할 수 있는지 스스로 자기를 도울 수 있는 자조기법들, 셀프 테크닉 같은 것을 아니면은 어디로 의뢰하면 될지 리퍼럴 시스템을 함께 제공을 해야 된다고 하였습니다. 그리고 유가족들이나 생존자들을 도울 때 구체적인 도움, 그들이 지금 힘들어하고 있는 그런 구체적인 문제에 대한 구체적인 도움을 제공을 해야 되는데 대부분 그냥 면담만 두리뭉술한 명단만 하거나 이런 경우에는 큰 도움이 되지 못한다고 하였고 그 정신과나 이러한 도움을 주는 사람들이 유연하게 상황에 따라서 도움을 주는 방법을 생각해 보아야 한다고 하였습니다. 59페이지 윗슬라이드 보시면 이러한 심리적인 도움을 제공할 때 여러 최신 방법들, 기법들을 알고 그것을 제공할 수 있어야 된다고 하였고 언론을 효과적으로 사용해야 된다고 하였습니다. 언론이 문제가 되는 경우도 굉장히 많아서 힘들 때도 있고 아틀레 박사님 자녀분들 두 분이 기자여서 언론과 잘 지내야 되지만 언론이 되게 힘들 때도 있는데 언론을 사용을 해서 정보를 제공하는 기능을 갖게 하거나 아니면 언론과 좋은 관계를 유지해서 긍정적인 관계를 하는 것도 중요하다고 하였습니다. 그리고 지도자의 중요성, 그리고 절차와 상징, 의례의 중요성에 대해서도 언급을 하였고 예를 들어 기념비를 세우거나 기억하는 방법에 대해서는 함께 고민해서 진행해야 될 부분이라고 하였습니다. 그다음에 집단에 따라 집단의 중요성의 우선순위, 그들이 필요한 걸 우선순위를 잘 생각을 해야 되는데 유가족이 가장 먼저 생각이 되어야 되고 그 다음에 생존자들, 그리고 마지막으로 구조자들, 도움을 주고 있는 사람들 이 순서로 집단의 집단이 도움을 필요로 하는 것을 우선순위를 갖고 접근을 해야 된다고 하였습니다.
I skipped that one, and I just want to use as an example for you of an intervention that we've used with a ferry disaster. We've used it with a train crash, a helicopter crash, and lately with this event, which was the murder on this small island. 69 people were killed on this island. And what we did there was that we used weekend gatherings. We had all the bereaved children, parents, step-parents and step-children gathered on a hotel from Friday to Sunday. And we had up to 250 of them present at these gatherings. And these are gatherings with a very clear structure. We have a leadership for this structure. We have clear aims for it. We use plenary speeches. We use small groups. With children, they have activity groups. We also have in important persons. The leader of the commission was in there, and different persons with a responsibility. The judge, the prosecutor was in telling how the court case would go. So we've used informational in there, but we most of all have small group meetings in this. They meet in small groups for 10 to 15 of these parents. That means we are a lot of group leaders. We've been up to 40 group leaders that work with smaller groups in this. The clear aims here are mentioned here. It's to help them cope. It has to help them live as best as possible with their grief. And we have gatherings with a progression in the themes over time. So when we started the first, it was 4 months after the disaster, and then we had another one a half year later, and then we had one when we passed the 1 year anniversary, and 9 months after that we had the last. So there's different themes that we focus on that are tailor-made to the development of grief over time. So we give input and we get helping suggestions, and they get a chance to organize their reaction or their actions or their thoughts during this. As I mentioned, some of what will be the focus and the different gatherings here. I don't think I had in the fourth and your material there. And just to show you here, I put on my glasses and I want you to translate that little thing that the girl that's part of an activity. They're asked about what do they miss the most, and she writes, "What I miss the most is her beautiful smile, her hair, and when we laughed so much together that I almost got a cramp, and everything we should do together, that we had planned to do together." That's what she's writing on this. So if you just translate that, and then we'd go. I'll take 2 more, and then you'll end it. Just what she said.
네, 여기 사진에 쓰여져 있는 것은 어떤 게 가장 보고 싶냐, 그립냐 질문을 했을 때 내가 가장 그리운 것은 그 사람의 아름다운 미소, 머리카락, 함께 웃다가 배가 아팠던 일, 그리고 앞으로 우리가 함께 하기로 계획했었던 일들이라고 적혀 있습니다.
And you can read here the different contents that are in here, and they practice self-help techniques. They get a lot of information, and we found it incredibly effective to reach out in that way. And if you look what the parents say, they are, in the first one, there's over 90% who says that it was extremely helpful or very helpful. And as we go out in time, they find that they're even more helpful. The reason it goes a bit down here is that there's always new parents coming in who've heard that this is really helpful. So that makes it, then it's not so helpful for them. But it still is there's no one at all who says that this was counterproductive or unnecessary. So it's a very good way of reaching out to them. Last slide is some of the complications we've seen, and some of the difficulties that comes up in this. We've seen in disasters, in this disaster and in other disasters, there's often disputes between professional groups. We also saw that those who were bystanders, those who came to an event, who was not sort of bereaved of others, the system didn't see them. So there's people out there that we don't recognize as in need of help, and we should have a broad perspective. We have the problem with young people who don't want help, as I know you've dealt with too. The high expectations, destructive internet activities where they on Facebook say so much that it really creates problems by using the internet. Sometimes we normalize so much that people feel that they're not normal because they don't have enough reactions, or the vice versa. And we had problems also when it came to some of the strategy for the court case and the preparations that we did here. But we did a lot of work of making guidelines there. I'll end with this. You don't see it well, but there's holes here. There's bullet holes. This is at the 1-year anniversary. And the families who lost a son here, I was with them down here, they have put roses into the bullet holes. Now that has to do with growth and future perspective too. They want something positive to come out of this event. BBC made a program on the follow-up of this event that some of you might want to tap into. But I know I've overstayed with some minutes. You'll have some minutes and then we end.
네, 60페이지 윗 슬라이드 러닝 포인트 요점들 읽어보시면 되고, 아래 사진들 보시면 여러 가지 선박 사건이나 항공 사건들의 사진들이고, 가운데 있는 섬 사진이 노르웨이에서 약 70명이 사망한 총격 사건이 발생했던 그 섬의 사진이라고 합니다. 그래서 이 총격 사건의 유가족들을 데리고 주말 워크샵 모임을 개최를 하였는데요. 이 모임에 대해서 간단하게 소개 드리겠습니다. 이 모임은 유가족들이 모두 모여서, 즉 배우자, 부모, 자녀, 손주까지 모두 모여서 약 250명 정도가 함께 진행을 하였다고 하고요. 굉장히 명확한 구조를 가지고 진행이 되어서 처음에 강의도 있고, 그 다음에 소규모 토론들로 진행이 주로 되었다고 합니다. 굉장히 명확한 그 목표를 가지고 진행을 했고, 여러 그 유가족들뿐만이 아니라 높은 사람들과 이 사건과 관련되어 있던 검사나 책임자들 같은 관계자들도 참석을 하였다고 합니다. 그래서 총 4번의 이러한 모임을 가졌는데, 첫 번째 모임은 사건 4개월 후에 진행이 되었고, 두 번째 모임은 6개월 후, 세 번째 모임은 1년 후, 그다음에 네 번째 모임은 1년 9개월 후에 진행이 되었다고 합니다. 그래서 각각의 모임이 시간이 지남에 따라서 그 시기에 맞는 목표가 있고 주제와 내용이 있었고, 마지막 네 번째 모임의 주제는 시간이 지남에 따라 이러한 슬픔과 애도를 어떻게 어떻게 함께 살아갈 것인지에 대해서 대화를 하였다고 합니다. 그 아래 사진 보면 이제 이 아이가 그 워크숍에서 썼던 종이가 있었고요. 62페이지 보시면은 이러한 그 워크숍을 통해서 2박 3일 워크숍을 통해서 여러 가지 내용들을 다루게 되는데, 스스로 도울 수 있는 여러 가지 테크닉들, 자조 기법들도 연습을 하는 시간도 있다고 합니다. 아래 슬라이드 보시면 굉장히 많은 사람들이 도움을 받았다고 대답을 하였고, 처음에서 뒤로 갈수록 굉장히 도움이 되었다라고 말하는 사람들의 숫자가 더 증가를 하고, 새로 참가하는 사람들도 더 늘어났다고 합니다. 63페이지 윗 슬라이드 보시면 이제 이러한 재난에 대응할 때 발생할 수 있는 문제들이나 어려움들에 대해서 나열이 되어 있는데, 전문가 집단들 간의 갈등이 발생할 수 있고, 그다음에 생존자나 유가족들이 아닌 그 외의 사람들을 충분히 추적 관찰할 수 없다는 점, 그리고 청소년들이나 더 어린 사람들이 도움을 거부할 때, 그리고 도움에 대한 기대가 너무 높을 때, 그다음에 인터넷 사용을 페북을 너무 안 좋게 많이 하는 등의 문제가 되는 인터넷 사용, 그다음에 이것도 정상이다, 저것도 정상이다, 이런 식으로 노멀라이제이션을 너무 많이 해서 생기는 문제들이 있을 수 있고, 그다음에 재판과 관련해서 여러 가지 그 지침서들을 작성을 하였다고 합니다. 그 밑에 사진 보시면 이 섬에서 발생한 총격 사건에서 이 꽃 밑에 잘 보이지는 않지만 총알 구멍들이 있는데, 이 사건의 1주년 기념일에 이 장소를 다시 유가족들이 방문을 해서 그 부모가 총알 구멍이 있던 자리에 꽃을 꽂아 놓은 거라고 합니다. 그래서 이 부정적인 것을, 사건을 좀 성장과 미래와 좀 더 긍정적으로 바라볼 수 있는 하나의 절차로 생각하시면 될 것 같습니다.
열정적으로 강연해주신 우리 지그레이 박사님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 더불어서 굉장히 좀 힘든 오랜 시간 동안 총각을 하신 우리 장형윤 선생님께도 박수 한번 부탁드리겠습니다. 자, 그럼 지금부터 박사님의 특강에 대한 질의 응답 시간을 좀 갖도록 하겠습니다. 플로어에서 질문이 있으신 분은 손을 들어주시고요. 가급적이면 자신의 성함과 소속을 밝혀주시고 질문을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다. No. 혹시 플로어에서 질문 없으신가요? 너무 강의가 너무 충실하셨나요? 그러면 질문이 없으시면 바로 휴식을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 예정된 시간이 어차피 예정된 시간이 좀 다 돼서요. 질의응답 이거 간략히 생략하는 것으로 하고요. 지금부터 20분 동안 휴식 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 밖에 간단한 다과가 준비되어 있으니 즐겨주시고요. 원활한 심포지엄 진행을 위해서 휴식을 취하신 후에 자리를 좀 지켜주시기 바라겠습니다.